podcasts become popular by people spreading them via word of mouth.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Front Lounge episode. What is this?
This is 12.
12. It's just the four of us again. Last week we did the recap of Lunatic, and this week we're just going to talk freeform, freestyle. It's like parkour, but for talking.
12 episodes. I'm pretty proud of us for getting this far in this. It means that we've talked shit for like at least 12, probably more like 15 or 20 hours.
I don't think people realize how much work goes into these podcasts. Mm-hmm. The weeks, and each week it's kind of like South Park, where they start on a Thursday and an episode comes out the next Thursday, and it's just kind of 24/7 working on the content and trying to get it.
We use Final Draft. It's a collaborative script editing software, and we use it to script our podcasts.
The amount of takes it took for me to get this line with all the errors in my speech correct. I mean, I had to redo that line 100 times just to get it.
It does give you but it does. I watched Phantom Thread last night with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Don't spoil it.
I won't give any plot spoilers. Don't worry, or anything like that. Number one, it's a Paul Thomas Anderson movie, so you can't give plot spoilers. It's like it doesn't work. But holy shit, that guy's a good actor. He's one of those ones where everything they say is true.
Yeah, we were just talking about him last week, I thought, and he does still live up to that. Being as lauded as he is, it's worth it, or it's valid.
Sometimes it's a hindrance to Paul Thomas Anderson, and he mess with your ability to judge a movie because he's an excellent director. Just his literal craft is amazing, and Daniel Day-Lewis as well, also amazing actor. So it's very difficult to form an opinion about the movie as a whole because the parts are so good.
That's why sometimes I feel the same way about certain pieces of music. Modern production now is so good technically that it tricks you into thinking it's good, where if you heard it done or executed less well, you'd realize it was a bad song or a boring song. But they just dazzle you with
Well, that's why on the next album I'm trying to do intentionally bad production just so that you can really have the good song shine through. Breaking news. What other than seeing Phantom Fred, what you guys been up to?
Phantom Fred.
50 Shades Phantom
50 Shades. This latest thing is every time we're going around LA, you see all these 50 Shades Freed posters. Yeah. And it's just... If you just think of it as Fred the Australian, he's showing up to a sex party. Hey guys, welcome Fred. This is his first sex party. Fred, did you bring your handcuffs? Oh, it's all right. You can use mine. I don't mind. But next time, be sure to bring your own, mate.
We make fun of Australians a lot for some reason, and I'm sure they make fun of South Africans in Australia, and that's fine. But I went to an ice cream store the other day to get some pistachio ice cream, and I said, "Hey, can I just get a pint to go of pistachio?" He goes, "Oh, mate, we're out of pistachio." And I took everything in my power not to laugh.
Forgive me, listeners, if you've heard this before, but my favorite Australian thing I've heard was on Runyon Canyon. I heard the Australian guy go walking down in his sandals. He said, "Oh, I love the kombucha aisle."
At a Whole Foods?
Yeah. Oh, there's got a whole aisle just for kombucha, mate.
Well, didn't you have a theory that Australians love saying the word 13 or 14? 30?
No, it's just the easiest way to teach the accent is those teenage numbers. You say 13 through 18. Yeah, and that's just you put a dean instead of a teen.
I was watching that show Glitch. It's an Australian show. It's actually a fairly interesting show, kind of weird mystery type show, and I filmed it and sent a video to you of the guy saying something about like 13 to 14 years ago. I can't hear that now without thinking of Danny.
I can't get my accent straight between New Zealand and the other Australians. I'd need
Neither
to.
can they.
Yeah.
Well, the new Thor was directed.
That's very funny, that movie.
Yeah, but that's a New Zealand accent, I believe, right?
Yes.
That big alien
or
character.
Or another good director, Taika Waititi, is that his name?
Something like that.
I heard rumors that they're going to be making more Flight of the Conchords.
He wrote a bunch of those episodes. This guy who directed Thor.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, Brett and Jemina. I'd be pretty happy if they came back with more episodes.
Yeah. He also did What We Do in the Shadows.
And that they're making a series of that. Do you see that?
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah.
They just have a different sense of humor that is hysterical.
It's like they've been on a massive island for a long time.
About 13 or 14 days ago, I was in an Uber, and it was an African driver. It was an Uber pool, so there was 3 of us in there, and nobody talked the whole way, really. It was just everyone on their phone. And we pull up at a stoplight, and the driver looks out the window, and he looks dumbfounded, and he's staring there. And then he looks at us, and he goes, Is this a hotel for pets? It's this big building that says Pet Hotel, and he could not grab his head around the concept of a place where you take your pet that's like a luxury hotel, you know?
Yeah.
He was he'd recently moved here from, I can't remember, I think he's Ghana, but it does put in perspective, sitting there in an Uber, you're on your phone, literally in your own world, and all of a sudden this concept of the relativity of luxury that exists in the countries hits you, and everyone just kind of cracked up laughing, and he thought it was hilarious that there's a place that you take your pets.
Yeah,
it is shampoo funny.
But it's not even.
He said, "Jeez, money makes you crazy."
Yeah, he said money can make you crazy.
But that you were probably driving on Highland Avenue, which is like
Highland or La Brea.
Yeah, it's
Highland,
the pet hotel district of LA. That's just like. It's like walking down a street in Times Square. It's all hotels.
Have you seen that Just Food for Dogs place? It's a kitchen where they make like fresh food for dogs, and it's one of the fanciest looking kitchens. It's this open kitchen. It looks like some sort of modern, Michelin star restaurant, but they're just making food for dogs.
I think this is what the Romans were doing right before the fall of Rome.
As much as I like to make fun of it, though, if you have the money and you have a dog, like, why not spoil? I mean, you spoil other human beings that don't deserve it nearly as much as a dog does.
Yeah, dogs deserve spoiling, yeah. There's only a dog. You could spoil a dog as much as you want. It will never get as bad as a spoiled human.
That's a very good point. It doesn't take. You don't even have to try to spoil a human. They go rotten anyway. Other breaking news was someone sent this video to one of our groups of this guy clapping. I believe the band is called the Boston Naturals. They're kind of a cover band in, I'm assuming, Boston. Yeah. And this video has kind of gone viral. It's them playing a cover of some like pop punk song from the 90s or 2000s, and there's a guy in the corner, one of the people at the wedding or the event, clapping along, and they have animated every one of his claps and like amplified the clapping sound, and he doesn't hit one single beat in time.
Yeah.
And it's been going viral, particularly among musicians and crew dudes, because we've all been on stage with one of those people just clapping so badly out of time that it starts fucking you up.
I mean, that show we did in Montreal at the Metropolis was simultaneously one of the best and worst crowds ever, I think, because it was an amazing show. It was packed and the crowd was really into it. But when we would do songs and people would clap along, I hate to say it, Montreal, but you guys were maybe the worst on the tour in terms of clapping in time.
Who else has been the worst? I feel like it's that whole vicinity.
Yeah.
It's Minneapolis has been pretty bad at clapping in time.
We were somewhere recently doing an acoustic thing with Judah and the Lion, with that radio thing, Johnson City, Tennessee, something like that. Yeah. It's a small little town, and it was a really cool show. Like 1,500 people came to see us play like 3 or 4 songs acoustic, and then Judah and Lion did 3 or 4 songs acoustic. It was really fun, but there was this lady in the front row clapping, and I could barely hear you guys because the monitoring situation was terrible. I actually stopped playing accordion and started clapping at her to try and get her in time, and the whole crowd like recognized that I was doing that and like kind of laughed along. It was really funny.
Yes. Have you seen the Harry Connick Junior video where they were clapping in time, they were just clapping on 1 and 3, and he wanted to flip them to 2 and 4, so he added a beat.
Explain that concept, Joe.
Oh yeah, in a division of a normal measure of music, like it's a unit of time, there's 4 divisions, and you can emphasize the first and the third division or the second and the fourth, and depending on the kind of music you're making, you want to emphasize 1 and 3 or 2 and 4. And Harry Connick Jr. was not, he wanted them to emphasize 2 and 4 along with him, and they were emphasizing 1 and 3. So he added an extra beat to one of the bars and flipped them without them knowing to 2 and 4. which is very difficult to do. I mean, he did it seamlessly.
Off the cuff it's almost impossible.
It's hard to flip the beat intentionally.
Yeah, it's hard to flip the beat intentionally, and then just to make nothing of it and to just do it. He was totally chill, and that was one of the cooler videos.
Well, Garen and those guys all make fun of me now because on Come With Me Now, when I do the clapping and the accordion solo, on the record it's on 2 and 4, and I always tried for about 2 or 3 years. I tried to get audiences to clap on 2 and 4, and you just couldn't do it. And I had multiple people tell me, like, you got to just start clapping on 1 and 3 because the audience is never going to clap on 2 and 4. So I eventually went back to clapping on 1 and 3, and then Garen was like, "Who is this? 1 and 3 Dylan?" And he started giving
Downbeat Dylan.
Downbeat Dylan, yeah. Right, that's way better of a nickname. He started calling me Downbeat Dylan because I just flipped it around, and then...
Oh, yeah, so it wasn't even on 2 and 4. You were clapping on upbeat, so like the ands. On Come With Me Now, it's so that's why it's kind of difficult.
It's 2 and 4 and a double if you're counting double.
Yeah, it's the and. 1 and a 2 and 1
depending
and
on
two.
how you're dividing the bar.
But the crew guys also have in-ear monitors, and they can talk to each other during the show without us hearing it. So from what I understand, every time that part of the song would come up, Garen would say on the microphone to the other crew guys, "All right, here comes Downbeat Dylan. Here we go."
Also, for those couple of weeks that he was mixing front of house, he'd be there at the front of house board, and I'd look at him, and he would just be waving his arms like one of those like middle-aged women clapping their arms at a wedding or something like that, really big, over the head clap. So Garen would be doing that on 1 and 3.
I have something I do on "It's a Good Life" because I kind of start the crowd clapping on that song, and I always clap a kind of weird beats, like only 2 and 3 beats while I clap, and I do that for a while, and then inevitably someone in the audience realizes I'm only doing 2 and 3, and the minute I lock up with that person and they think they've figured out the pattern that I'm doing 2 and 3, I change it to like 2 and 4, and I just keep constantly changing what I'm doing. People trying to like copy the clap that I'm doing.
No wonder they think you can't clap in time.
It's intentional.
Maybe he's been the problem all along.
Yeah.
Well, there's certain parts of certain songs that you just get bored and you start looking for fun things to do. That's talking about clapping. Let's move on to the music only section because this dude can really do cool beats and clapping. It's a guy called Zakir Hussein. He's an Indian tabla player. And I was just doing a little bit of reading about this because he's someone we've all listened to a lot, and we'll put some links to some of his music. But they use a term in India, I guess, and across various parts of the Middle East and then India, Pakistan, called ustad, which, from my understanding, my reading, means teacher, basically. But it's also like a term of respect, so that musicians at a certain point earn the title of ustad, like almost like Sir Paul McCartney, but this is related specifically to a discipline like music or yoga or anything. So he's Ustad Zakir Hussein, and it's just a way of saying that he's a master in this world. So he's a tabla player, and what's really interesting is the system of rhythm that they have in India is just so entirely different. We were talking earlier about like 2 and 4 and 1 and 2, and that
right.
It's just so much more complicated that if you've ever been to a classical Indian concert and seen people in the audience tapping along with it, they're doing all these intricate system of like counting on their fingers, and there's no way you can figure it out just by watching. Like it's such an in-depth system, so it's really interesting to watch that as an audience member, but then also to watch a couple of YouTube videos where they teach you that counting system.
Yeah, it's similar to flamenco music, the long cycles, but I think it's even more complex than that. But
I think the tabla skill is similar in certain ways to drumming with sticks or Western drumming, but it's different in so many other ways, and in that the use of the hands and the fingers and the different parts of the palm, the way they use it to give the drum a different pitch, or also on the side of the drum are leather straps where you can press it in and change the pitch of the drum. So there's a sort of melodic content to the music, and they're only using usually 2 drums, but they can get however many 100 different pitches out of it. And so it's a very fine motor skill of those fingers and the slapping, and you tap it with your finger and it gives you a certain sound, or you slap it with the side of your finger and then the thumb, and it's truly a discipline that's, in a way, to me seems impossible.
Yeah.
Even though I play drums my whole life.
It's also one of those things that every drum circle douchebag has kind of like messed up forever, because it's that or like a djembe or like an African drum, and they're just like going dun dun da 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 dun da, like some really rudimentary boring rhythm, and it's just like that's what most people think of when they think of tablas or djembes now.
Well, do you remember that classical Indian concert we went to in Phoenix at ASU, I think, and the audience was also incredibly aware of the time signatures and the rhythms that they were playing, because like most concerts that you go to, people will be bobbing their head or they'll be stomping their foot on downbeats or whatever, but you would see a whole lot of the audience was actually counting on their fingers with certain hand gestures and using different finger patterns to kind of stay along or keep up with what the music was or what the players were doing. And then also I think it's related to, depending if it's classical music where it's reciting a scripture or something like that, it's going to have so many different laws and things to follow.
Yeah, what's interesting,
a structure to follow.
It's the way we talk about Indian food a lot, like the names of Indian food. It's just like palak paneer means spinach cheese.
Yeah,
it's the same thing with Indian classical music. Most of it just says rag bhairavi, which means the Bhairavi scale. And then it'll be in teen tal, which is like a certain time signature or rhythmic grouping.
Right.
It's just purely descriptive. It'd be like, I guess the old classical music was like that. It'd say sonata in D minor, waltz in whatever,
Yeah.
There's no like coming up with a cool title like this song is
When
called.
did that start, though, in like Western classical music? They got really romantic with the names. Is it the romantic?
I don't know specifically,
I don't know
but
the
probably.
eras or whatever. Yeah. Well, that you were saying the laws about if they're reciting from a scripture, the Mahabharata was transmitted orally, wasn't it, over thousands of years?
Yeah.
They used cadences of poetry and laws of poetry to orally transmit the longest poem on Earth over thousands of years and keep perfect accuracy. Similar to how programming uses like a checksum at the end of a program to validate what was transmitted. So they use the cadence, and they know that if somebody is reciting a verse out of the correct laws of the poetry, that it wasn't transmitted correctly. So, we like telephone, the laws of telephone enter immediately. If I tell you something and then by the time you've told one person, it's been distorted. So to think of a poem that long being transmitted over thousands of years is just ridiculous.
Yeah, that lines up when they have discovered later written forms of it. It's still it's in sync with the orally transmitted one. And it's interesting, I didn't know that about the checksum idea, but when I was dabbling around with a bit of computer programming back in the day and reading about it a lot, there were a lot of people saying that if you wanted to use a natural language for programming or as a basis for programming, that Sanskrit would have made an amazing language for programming because it's so class-oriented, meaning not class in like the social sense, like in the structure of nouns and verbs and everything. So just really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's the Vedas as well that were transmitted like that for thousands of years orally. And don't quote us on any of this stuff in case we were wrong about it. But yeah, the laws. I don't know, obviously, the technicality of the laws that govern those, the cadence and also the tone and pitch of all those the poems. They followed a very specific structure so they could last thousands of years. Like imagine transmitting something accurately for thousands of years without writing it down.
Mo can't even get his food order right.
Well, but also certain languages like English, which obviously have now become adopted as the main language of the world in business and all that sort of thing. It's not very precise language to describing certain things.
English.
Yeah. Certain ideas are very difficult to describe accurately because of the, I guess, idiomatic nuance.
Is that a fault of English, or is it just a fault of accurate identifying of things? Because English's strength seems to be that it just takes from everywhere. It just takes.
I just mean like the kind of joke of like the Greeks or the Russians sitting around. They're like, well, we have a word to describe this feeling, or like even like the Portuguese word. What's saudade?
Saudade, saudade.
Yes. Saudade. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's a one word to describe a very complicated emotional state that in English you'd have to be like, well, it's kind of like nostalgia.
Missing a person,
longingness, but not in a negative way. It's that kind of thing. That
but that's
I'm not
my
saying
question.
English is bad.
My question, though, is that the fault of a language, or is it just identifying that emotion? Or is it a two-way street? If the language is limited, obviously there's less emotions to identify. But
I think it depends a little bit on the language and the complexity of denotations within a language, because even in English, pitch and all those factors actually play into the meaning of a word, It kind of reminds me of is it Osho who has that video about the word fuck?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so he talks about the word fuck and how many different things it can mean,
right?
With a different inflection or in different contexts, and it's it's sort of a funny, crude little description of this problem of how does language transmit something accurately when there's such a subjective element to it. There we go, subjective. Ding, first usage on the podcast.
Put $5 in the subjective jar.
Well, maybe just to
give you a sense, I'm just trying to verify some of the things we're saying on Wikipedia, but they're saying an example is all 1,028 hymns and 10,600 verses of the Rig Veda were preserved in this way, using very complex kind of mnemonic devices and tones, and that not only the language was preserved and the content, but the pitch and tone were preserved over thousands of years in that way.
Yeah, it's great. We were in Hawaii on a hike, and you guys were playing that game where you say, I'm taking like a backpack, a cookie, and
it's a memory game,
beer to the thing, and then the next person has to add on a word, and you have to carry on this thing, adding to it each time, and how quickly that gets hard. Obviously, that's random words with not necessarily any meaning, but then to think about conveying that amount of information across time.
Backpack gets very heavy when you all those.
So maybe just to finish out this music section while we're in that word, and because we're talking about the ustad and the master, this designation or this word used to describe a master of music. There's another artist from India called Ustad Bismillah Khan, and he was a Shehnai player, which is a double-reeded instrument.
It's like an oboe, like a small oboe.
Yeah, in fact, my understanding is that it actually came from an oboe. Like it's, there've obviously been double-reeded instruments throughout ancient times, but this worked backwards. It was originally a Western instrument that then became part of the Indian musical kind of vocabulary. Either way, we'll put a link to this guy. It's some of the most emotionally stirring music in a way that I haven't had this similar experience with other types of music. When they have a drone that starts most of their songs, and then the main Shehnai player comes in and plays around that drone, and he can bend. It's it's fully bendable note. It's not fixed frets or anything, and they just hit notes that you just can't hit any other way. It's why I think people like our slide solos on our music, is because those non-fretted or non-fixed instruments are able to reach places that other people can't reach. Yeah. And the Shehnai is one of the most amazing at doing that.
Yeah, I was watching. We'll move on quickly, but the guy Leonard Bernstein, the composer, he's obviously amazing. But he did a little recap of music history and how harmony developed, and it was basically wrong. His recap of how harmony developed and how scales developed, and it was, as usual, the overemphasis on the importance of temperament and of 12-tone scales and all that. Basically, not recognizing that there are ancient harmonic traditions that value different things about harmony than we do.
Yeah. This guy, Bismillah Khan, when he died, the Indian government declared that day a day of national mourning, and he was given a full state funeral to kind of put into perspective his importance to India and their musical scene. So that's what we're aiming for.
Yeah,
we want a full state full state funeral when KONGOS pops off.
Yeah,
in India.
Someone was at the door.
America should have a knighthood tradition. Like they should touch you on each shoulder with an M16 or something.
No, a hot dog on one side, M16.
So let's move on to the music business. And Jesse had someone he wanted to talk about, and he said, I'll tell you on the podcast.
So I've been listening to this podcast called How I Built This with Guy Raz. It's an NPR show, but they have a podcast too. Basically interviews entrepreneurs or business people or people who have sort of risen to the top of their field, usually with an unusual way, or there's something unique to the story. So I'd listened to a bunch of them, and I just kind of randomly listened to this one, and it was titled Power Rangers. And it's about this guy named Haim Saban, he's a composer, a media guy. He's the media mogul. He's worth something like $1 billion or $2 billion or something. But when you hear his story and how he got there, it's one of the most interesting music business stories that I've ever heard. And I won't spoil the whole thing for you, but if you listen to it, the one part that kind of struck me was when he moved to America. I think he was born in Egypt, grew up in Israel, eventually made his way over to America. And he was trying to figure out a way to make money in music. You know, he had written songs, but he didn't really consider himself a great musician or songwriter. So he called up ASCAP and BMI. And for those of you who don't know, ASCAP and BMI are collection agencies. Basically, they monitor all kinds of performances of music around the world, or in the case of ASCAP, in the U.S. So if something gets played on the radio, gets played on TV, or any recording gets performed publicly, they monitor that and they collect money for those performances, and then they distribute them to the composers and the publishers and everybody who's deserving of a cut. So he asked them how it works. When music's on TV, like how do you guys pay that out? And they said, well, it's based on the amount of time that the music plays for. So he goes, and he looks at like regular TV shows, and you might hear 10 seconds of music. And then he looked at cartoons, and he realized that there's music constantly in these old cartoons. Like the whole show is music. Yeah. So he's like, that's what I'm going to do. He starts making music for cartoons. Eventually he gets like 3 studios going. He's producing music left and right for almost every cartoon, and he makes millions and millions of dollars really quickly. He just kind of became that go-to guy for cartoon music. Then how it gets to the Power Rangers thing is this guy. He's like a really funny guy. He was in Japan, and he saw Power Rangers on TV, and it had been going for like 10 years or something like that. And he thought it was like he got a real kick out of it. And he thought this should be a hit in America. So he realized that most of the scenes in Power Rangers, they had their masks on. So all the action scenes were already shot. He's like, I could just use those and then reshoot the other scenes in English. And then when they put their masks on, you could just overdub whatever you want, So he bought the rights to Power Rangers, and it took him like 10 years. He couldn't get anybody in America to make it. Eventually, like he made it himself, and like NBC got it, or some network got it, and it beat everything else on Saturday morning. And that's how he like basically became a billionaire. He built this media empire. So
that's insane.
I thought.
Wait, was Power Rangers?
I thought now would be a good time to announce that we're changing to cartoon music. That KONGOS will be a cartoon.
Didn't we get a sync
Power
in
Rangers
Power
a cartoon, or was it live action?
It was live action.
I think it was both.
Well, he was talking about the live action one.
Okay.
I think we got a sync in Power Rangers, and
the new. I think Come With Me was in the new movie.
I listened to that podcast long ago.
We should do a podcast where it's just the cliff notes of other podcasts.
Well,
I think there's a podcast called Podcast of Podcasts or something like that, and they just summarize other podcasts. Yeah.
The amount of times I've been told about a podcast or told somebody about a podcast, and then it takes them, weeks or months or years to ever actually listen to it. That's basically where I think we should just listen to other podcasts and tell their stories and claim them as our own. No one's going to ever know.
I've got an idea for a law which you would need a dictator to implement, but it's a recommendation quota. You only get to recommend so many things, a week. And then you have to do it digitally so everybody can count how many recommendations you've made.
All right, so moving on to the next segment, member berries. I had just a funny little story that was brought to my attention and remembered recently, and it was when we first moved to the States from South Africa. We all had pretty South African accents, and getting used to the American accent was quite difficult at first, and then eventually you start to adopt the American accent so that people understand you. But one of my most vivid memories was in PE class. On the way to it, walking from one of the classes to the PE class, I was asking a kid what we were doing.
What grade?
This was 5th grade, so I was 10 years old. And the kid said, "We're doing square dance." And I said, "Square dance?" And he said, "Yeah, we're doing square dance." And I said, "Did you say square dance?" And I must have asked him like 4 or 5 times to repeat what he was saying. He just kept on saying, "Square dance, square dance." So I thought he said squirt ants. And I had no idea what it was. I went home and I told my parents, I said, "We're doing something called squirt ants in a PE class." And we spent about 10 minutes trying to figure out like what we would be doing. And my mom said, "Is it some type of pest control that they have the kids involved in?" Like, we were absolutely confused. And so then the next day I go back to PE class, and we start getting into squares and holding hands and dancing around, and that was one of my first memories from moving to the States. Yeah, it was a kind of a fish out of water experience moving to the States for the first time. There are a bunch of those things where just the culture of school, or at least our school that we went to in South Africa, which was kind of lawless in so many ways. Coming to the States, I was reprimanded on so many occasions for doing things that I thought were completely normal. I was like, what? You guys don't do this here?
Well, in South Africa, our PE teacher, we did Greek dancing some of the times and all that stuff. But we were in a tiny room unless we were outside. And he would just smoke when we were like 5 or 6 years old. He was smoking in the room, yeah.
It was a Greek private school in South Africa, and it was a great school. Like, we actually got a really good education there, but they did pretty much have their own rules. Like, our principal at the time was late almost every single day to school. Like, the bell would be ringing, and she would be getting out of her car in the parking lot. I remember that PE teacher, or PT we called it. He literally would get a soccer ball, give it to us, and say, "Go play soccer." And then he would sit there in his Adidas like jumpsuit and smoke cigarettes the whole time.
That was so much fun.
Yeah.
School back then was so much fun. And I think I may have told this already, but I did not do well at school in South Africa in terms of grades. It was hard. I felt like it was hard. You do exams and all that, and it would just...
all written. No such
all
thing as
written. I get like
choice.
D's and E's, and I came to America, put even less effort in, and had like close to a 4.0 GPA. Multiple choice tests, like paper or plastic. It was a joke.
That first time I took a multiple choice test, it was for like when we moved here, some placement into what math class I was going to be placed into. So I had to take a test. And I'd never seen a Scantron test before, the way you fill in the bubbles. So I went down and did the test, and I was putting X's on. I obviously didn't read the directions, but I was doing X's instead of filling in the little bubbles. And so they graded the test, and it came out like as a really bad score. And then the teacher looked at it, and she's like, "Oh, this is not how you fill out a Scantron test." So she sat with me, took my answers, and we filled out a proper one, and I got like a really high score in it and got put in the advanced math class.
Yeah.
Teaching you how to vote. Like everything in American school felt like they're preparing you to be a good citizen and do like all the things you're meant to do.
Well, when we
Doesn't
left,
the pep rally come from corporate?
Yeah, it started as corporate pep rally. Get everyone excited before the workday begins at the horrible factory.
Yeah.
When we left, you were doing what? Latin, Afrikaans, Greek, French, English, obviously, Zulu. You were learning like 5 or 6 languages. Everything had to be written form. It was the same thing. We came to the States. I would wake up halfway in the class with drool on my desk, and like I'd still be able to get through the class.
It's funny.
Basically, we're geniuses. I mean, no, it's quite clear.
It's the weird thing about American public school is there's that side of it, and then America still is putting out scientists. There is the Ivy League here. There is still amazing kind of brains in America. It's just that like average public school was just insanely easy, I thought.
Yeah, it's a country of 300 million people. I don't know.
Yeah, it's working.
I remember also hell and damn were not really considered. They weren't considered swear words in South Africa. Actually, most teachers were saying shit, fucking everything else in South Africa too. So, but when we got to
throwing staplers at kids
they still hadn't kind of come around to the idea of no corporal punishment. So there was still a little bit of.
Did you get corporal punished?
No,
I had stuff thrown at me.
Yeah, teachers would always just throw pens and pencil cases at you. But when we first went to school, they still had an official corporal punishment policy. Like kids would go get caned. But it was a Greek school also, so it was more like the threat of it, like, hey, listen, oiki, we will smack your bottom.
But when we came to the States and we had to do some project in one of the classes, which was draw a diagram of the room we were in. I don't know if it was teaching us mapping or something like that. And I just called the teacher over and I said kind of loudly, but not in a rude way. I just said, "Where the hell are the bathrooms in here?" and the whole class just like gasped and looked at me. And I just said, "What? You guys, you can't say that here?" And then, when we play football or soccer or anything out in the field, I'd take my shoes off. And I remember seeing this teacher run across the playground, like full speed at me and stop me in my tracks saying, "What are you doing? Why are you taking your shoes off?" I said, "Well, I can run faster. I want to just play with my shoes off." And she's like, "No, you have to put your shoes back on." It was just such a bizarre experience, having so many rules imposed on you about ridiculous things.
I remember it was one of the few times I participated in verbal bullying because I was, assimilating into American culture. In South Africa, it felt much more honest. We would get in little fights and stuff. All the kids would get in little fights when you couldn't hurt yourselves, and it was very honest. And then you were best friends like half an hour later. There was a lot more like psychological torture when we moved here. But I remember my best friend making fun of another kid for not knowing what a blowjob was, and. And I was like, "Yeah, he doesn't know what a blowjob is." And then I was like, "What the fuck is a blowjob?" So I was.
Was this senior year? Well, that's funny you bring that up because when we moved to America, I was 15, so I was like right in the middle of being a teenager.
This guy doesn't even know what black tar heroin is.
But I watched that movie Kids. I swear I think I've told this story so many times. I don't know whether I've said it on the podcast, but I watched that movie Kids, which is just this really fucked up movie about kids in New York. And I was convinced that was going to be my experience going to public school in America. I was like, that's it. I'm definitely going to be a heroin addict by like the middle of the week. It actually made me quite nervous. And then I went there and it was more like other movies, like Clueless. All right, so let's move on to our next section, which is gear.
What have we got?
Gear. Favorite piece of gear of the week. We thought we'd talk about these speakers called Auratone speakers. Now, these are old speakers. They're very small. Basically, every studio used to have them, and I remember our dad just saying, if you wanted something to sound crap, you play it on the Auratone, and if you can get it to sound good on there, you can get it to sound good anywhere. But that's kind of only half the story because we still have a bunch of the old ones, and we decided to hook one up one day in the studio. And basically, if we switch what you're listening to from your nice big studio monitors where everything sounds perfectly crystal clear and you can hear everything, and you switch it to these, it immediately reveals the essence of your sound. If something's out of balance, if the drums or the vocal or the bass or the guitar or whatever is out of balance, it'll tell you right away because you kind of hear the essentials on these speakers. And I've personally grown to really like the sound of them. It's a very pleasant, listenable sound. But it's one of the most useful tools in mixing a record, I find, is to be able to put your music on this tiny little speaker that doesn't have a lot of bass or doesn't have a lot of high frequency response, and you can check your work. So
It also kind of highlights on a lot of old records, like R&B records, James Brown, and that, how good they sound anywhere. And particularly those older type of records on these Auratones sound amazing. And it's obviously something that now we're thinking we need to try and start making records that sound better everywhere.
And also there was an approach on those old speakers, it kind of led me down this rabbit hole of wanting to buy some vintage speakers. So I found these old Japanese speakers from the 70s for $60 on OfferUp. And I got them up and working, and there's something special about the way music sounds on speakers from that era. There wasn't the emphasis on the big bass and the super crystal clear sibilance, and there's a musicality to them. So I don't know what it is.
Well,
but
the people making the music were making it for those speakers.
Yeah, but even modern music sounds good on them. So something was special. Also, at the time, like, they didn't do things as cheaply. They had to use real wood for the cabinets, and things weren't as cheap as they are now. So they made them. If you were to try and make that speaker today, it'd be very expensive. But like, no one gives a shit about old speakers, so you can get really good ones for cheap.
Next section here. What is it? Oh yeah, what's it like to be in a band with your brothers?
It's pretty cool.
Let's get straight to deep thoughts. We had these little notes written down in our notes of what to talk about here. I forget where I first heard. I think it was a Norm Macdonald podcast with Jerry Seinfeld, or someone else's podcast Jerry Seinfeld was on.
It was that. It was Norm Macdonald, yeah.
And they're talking about this idea of a TV show being a place. And what he meant by that was that he thought of Seinfeld, the show, not so much in terms of like the writing and the jokes specifically, but the feeling that people have is like, I'm going to this place in my living room where I'm actually kind of going into the world of Seinfeld, and it feels like home to me, or it feels like a place I get to visit.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a really interesting idea, because that is something you feel with the TV shows that really connect. Like the one we always talk about is The Wire. Like, obviously we have no relation to growing up in the streets of Baltimore, but it was so perfectly capturing that place that you felt like connected to it, like, I don't know, much more so than just the writing or the jokes or the scenes of a TV show.
Yeah, and they were talking about how do you create that space by turning off your cell phone or putting it on to vibrate. How do you create that space when either you're writing a TV show, or if you're writing a song, or you're producing an album or something like that? What is it that gives people that sensation that they're losing themselves and getting into your world?
Well, it made us sort of look at that concept in terms of what we do, being music primarily, and we thought, well, does that concept apply to what we do? And we basically agreed that in a lot of cases it does. There's certain kinds of music or certain types of bands where you put that band on and you do feel like you're in a space. You're kind of taken into their aesthetic of the world. And I think Kings of Leon is a good example of that band. Maybe it's partly because we have associations with the music where we listened. I first really listened to that music when we toured with them, So you associate it with a place, but, you kind of enter a world when you listen to that type of band. And so we started to think, I wonder if people do that with us, but maybe even more so we could approach that in the way that we make music. Let's take the listener to
Roy
a place.
Orbison's Blue Bayou. That is instant transportation to the scene he's describing, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think we've done a better job of that on this next album. I think because it's the first time we've recorded in a different place, actually. And also just the attitude that we took towards it and took towards the songs is just different from any of the previous albums. So now I think, listening back and listening to some of the demos and the rough mixes that we're getting now, I'm starting to feel like we've got a space or a place.
Yeah, it's like Cheers. That's what our new album's like, Cheers. Everybody knows your name.
For $10 you can buy an entire world. When we put this album out, or if you have a streaming service, it's practically free.
Or if you actually just torrent it, you can get it for free. Don't tell the label that we said that.
I think also we've been talking about this a little bit, and we might be getting close to actually announcing something concrete about this kind of docu-series that we've been working on. And that's something that really applies to this idea of a place, because it's about our time on the road, living on the bus, living out there, for months and months at a time. And we have this feeling of what the road feels like to us. It feels like a kind of concept that you can encapsulate. And we've really tried in the docu-series to try and convey that encapsulation to people so that you can feel like, oh, this is a little bit what it's like to be on the bus.
It's kind of funny how you can go to 100 places or however 200 places, however many places we've been around the world. And to us, there is this element of it feeling like one place, It's like, oh, we're going to Russia, but really we're going back to Tour, which feels like a single place.
Yeah. That is a funny way of thinking about it. It just blends in. Feels like home. So keep your eyes peeled. I think we're going to be making some concrete announcements, or making more announcements about announcements. One of the two.
I think we're definitely going to be posting something on Instagram within the next week to 1 year that is going to give you something definite about something we might do at some point. So, keep your...
I think we can commit to that.
Keep tuned in to watch this space, guys.
I'd say the ether is going to take more of a form. The nature of the form, I don't know, but it'll be not purely ethereal and not purely concrete, but somewhere there.
We're hoping to turn this idea into a concept with the right funding.
All right. Is that the end of our podcast?
Yeah, it was just a short one this week. We're going to get back into the studio and get working on things. But keep telling your friends to listen to this podcast. We'll keep doing it. And find us on kongos.com/podcast and Apple, iTunes, Spotify, everywhere you can find us, except not Spotify. They are launching a podcast service soon, though.
And you spell podcast, PODCASSED.
ER.